Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. We're here going through the book, The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. John, if you could show the book to everyone, that would be great. You are very welcome to come and join with us on this journey. At the bottom of this YouTube, in the description link, you'll be able to see the link to get the book, and all the chapters and stuff are available online. This week, we are going through chapters 4, 5, and 6. I'm joined by John, Darlene, and Matt. Thanks, guys, for joining. And hopefully we'll get to have a really good conversation as we reflect on those 3 chapters. I'm going to do my best to offer a summary on each of the chapters, and you guys will fill in the gaps where I mess up. And hopefully we can have some depth in this conversation. Let's kick off. Chapter 4, the Holy Trinity, the most easily understood concept of God that we have ever come into contact with. Right, guys? Yes? If I was to summarize this chapter, I think I would say it is the inexplicable doctrine of the Trinity that serves as evidence for the inexplicable God. There's my summary. What do you guys think, or how did you respond to this chapter? Did it strike anything for you? The concept of the Holy Trinity. Okay, if I can kick things off. Okay, go on.
I'm never afraid to go first.
All right.
Because I thought, well, 2 things. One is, well, the first thing is that I felt like he talked a lot about the Trinity, but didn't really throw out any evidence of the Trinity until like the last couple pages. And so I felt like, it did kind of stimulate some questions. And it's like, what is the biblical evidence for a Trinity? Obviously not much in the Old Testament, because the Jews up until Jesus's time did not believe in a Trinity.
Right.
And where did that belief come from? So presumably New Testament. And that is, in fact, I mean, he does throw in Genesis with, Genesis had some texts, as well as Job.
But you're right, it's predominantly,
but otherwise, yeah, mostly New Testament. So I'm glad he kind of pulled through and did pull out those texts. Otherwise, it was kind of a lot of deep thoughts on the Trinity and a lot of Thomas Carlyle. So I felt better after he was able to give those texts. The other thing, so the second thing, I was really struck by page 29, the very first sentence at the top of the page, and that is, every man lives by faith, and the non-believer as well as the saint, the one by faith in natural laws and the other by faith in God. And I do believe that everyone has a need to believe in something. And I think as Christians, obviously we believe in Jesus and God. I think as non-Christians, a lot of times people are kind of lost, or they have a strong belief in something totally different. But I'd never taken the extra step to say everyone lives by faith. And he comes out and says every man lives by faith. And I don't have any reason not to believe that.
Well, I support that. And I'll just jump maybe a sentence behind you, because I highlighted the one before, which supports that. He says on page 28, any real explanation of even the simplest phenomenon in nature lies hidden in obscurity and can no more be explained than the mystery of the Godhead. And I think his argument, which I have to agree with, is we all accept that mystery is a part of life. We all accept in the obscurities of life. And if you don't, I wonder if you deny obscurity or mystery, I wonder if you're denying humanity in and of itself. The reality is, as much as we don't know about stuff, we all find ways to explain our way around them or get over them and just move on. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to even assume that even in Christianity, I think a healthy belief in God is one which learns how to deal with the unknown God, with the mystery of God. Certainly for me, in all my years of being a Christian and my studies in theology, I still can't come up with a confident definition of the Trinity. because God is so far beyond my reaches. I'll do my best to give you language. I can give you some illustrations with ice and water and gas, but it's always going to come short. There's always going to be some element of the Trinity that really just isn't quite fully encapsulated in the truth of who God is. And it's something that I have reconciled with and just, I guess, moved on to things that I can understand, or at least attempt to understand. That's my take, at least, on it. D, Matt, any thoughts about your reflections on his view of the Trinity, or his presentation, at least?
I mean, of course, you can't help but think about like, how could this concept of Trinity, three gods in one, and playing kind of sort of like playing different roles as mentioned in the Bible. But yeah, it's if you really sit down and think about it, like, it's very, very difficult to wrap your mind around it. So to be quite honest, I stopped. I stopped doing that. I stopped trying. And but it's very interesting. I find that how in our society we always you have terms like, three is a crowd, or you're a third wheeler, or whatever. And yet here's God who comes in three, but there's always this emphasis of unity, as if in three is like the perfect community or perfectness.
Mm-hmm.
Where, you know what I mean? Whereas we in our own world, we're like, three is not a good thing. You can never have really, three is always not, you can never have like three friends that you can't be best friends with like two other people. You know what I mean? It has to be just one other person kind of thing. And it's always a kind of couple, and third person is always kind of like left out, or third wheel, or whatever. So yeah.
So I wonder, as I'm reflecting on what you're saying, because I relate to that totally with my childhood. I was I was part of a triangle friendship for a long time, and then it just didn't work after a while. I definitely resonate with that. Are we saying that the concept of the Trinity is simply not important to be a Christian, to the system of believing in God? Are we saying that you just need to just move on with that, if that's the case?
I think that's the point that he is making, that at some point you just have to have a faith in it and accept it and do move on, and that's what I'm doing, because
Fair enough.
My little mind can't. Yeah.
I don't know that a belief in the Trinity is essential for salvation. And I think Jesus would have put a lot more emphasis on it if it was. But I can't help but thinking that a belief in the Trinity may be essential, or I don't know if essential is the best word, but a way to enhance the relationship you have with God,
right,
and make it a more, perfect relationship in the imperfect world we live in. And I think Jesus does say, I am leaving. I can't be everywhere all the time with every single person in the world from now until the end of times, but I'm leaving you my Spirit, who is everywhere all the time from, for all eternity. And and they call, the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, the Comforter. And I think in a lot of ways, that's Jesus alluding to the Trinity, and why it was important was more for relationship than for salvation. I don't know. I could be wrong. I don't have any evidence to support that.
No, fair enough. That's your view. Matt, anything to chime into this?
Yeah, I was very conflicted about how he presented this. I latched on, like, John was saying, that one sentence about every man lives by faith. Totally agree with that. But then it was a sentence after that kind of got me, in that he starts to kind of set up this, seemed like a bit of false equivalence, potentially between the idea of science almost being a little bit incompatible with understanding God. And he kind of touches on that a few other areas in this chapter, where it's like, we can't trust our science and understanding it. I agree with that, but I disagree with the idea that, like, I don't believe that science and religion have to be at odds. And I know that there is a lot of belief that they have to be, like, they're not compatible in any way. And I think you can view science as a way of trying to fundamentally understand the world that God has given us, and even the aspects of God, and learning that. And so, you know, I don't think, I was conflicted about this in a few ways, and that the Trinity is so far beyond us, just dimensionally beyond what we're even able to comprehend.
Right.
But to basically kind of just, it felt like the argument he was going on is we can't understand it in any way. And that viewpoint proves it. I think it kind of then somewhat cheapens the idea that, you know, it may be infinity minus one or something, that God eventually reveals more of himself and we understand that more.
Right.
I don't think it's a fundamental knowledge requirement. It's an aspect of God that I think, you know, as we get to know him more, it's going to add just a wonderful, you know, hue to it that we won't even appreciate right now. But he got me a little bit. I got kind of hung up with the idea that the science and understanding of it has to implicitly be separated from.
I'm glad that you said that. I thought I was going mad, but I am having the picture that Tozer is quite a black and white writer in some respects, where this is wrong and that is right, and they're two are mutually exclusive. He doesn't just do that with science and religion. I felt like he did that with the when he described the idolatry of God, of creating a version that is if you are against him, any form of interpretation that is wrong is an attempt to describe God, and so therefore it's idolatry. And I just don't think that people's motives are always in that direction. Some people are genuinely trying to interpret God, and whether they're right or wrong is not what I'm arguing for. I'm just attempting to say that actually God is bigger than just your ability to perceive or understand him, and he actually is more graceful. So I do think that there was a little bit of definitely a black and white thinking in that, of saying science and faith are worlds apart. But I do like, however, how he was really trying to make a case for the legitimacy of faith. And what I mean by that is that as Christians, we've grown up all along being taught or told to have faith. And we're grappling with this word faith because for each of us, it means different things in kind of different ways. But there's a quote at the bottom of page 30, which I like. He says, you're laughing because you probably highlighted it.
Yep.
Yeah. Indeed, to seek proof is to admit doubt, and to obtain proof is to render faith superfluous. Everyone who possesses the gift of faith will recognize the wisdom of those daring words of one of the early church fathers. I believe that Christ died for me because it is incredible. I believe that he rose from the dead because it is impossible. I thought that was a really interesting kind of reflection on the idea of, once again, his black and white worldview. This is right, that is wrong. But also, there was some truth in the reality of there is this invitation to come and seek the unknown, because that is who God is. Anyway, those were my thoughts. I don't know if you guys wanted to say anything to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dee.
No, I don't have much to say about what Pastor just said, but going back to what John said about the three Godheads being essential to salvation, like, I mean, you know how when you get baptized, you say in the name of Father, you know, the Son and the Holy Spirit, right? Mm-hmm. I think, like, we as humans, we put value on each of the Godhead in that, like, we kind of in our minds somehow put them in a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Whereas I think
separate boxes almost.
Yeah. Whereas it truly, when it's described in the book, it truly is in unit, and you just cannot separate them out in any way. They're like one in unit. But I think we separated them out and put it into hierarchies, I think.
Yeah.
So is that the segue into chapter 5 or chapter 6?
We can go into chapter 5 if you want. which I'll be honest and say,
so I have
very
one
confusing
comment
chapter for me.
I have one comment on that quote, and I did mark it, especially that first part
Go on then.
where you said to seek proof is to admit doubt, and to obtain proof is to render faith superfluous. He's making the assumption that doubt is bad, and I don't necessarily believe that.
Yeah.
I think unbelief is bad because that's an understanding that's rejected, whereas doubt is just not a solid answer, but someone that can still seek, and God can work with someone like that.
I thought the same thing, especially within the context that we read that book, Saying No to God, and it really just opened up a whole can of worms around doubts and stuff, and that was really interesting. Sorry, go on.
And I'm not sure exactly what he means by rendering faith superfluous, but Jesus himself said, if you have faith as a mustard seed, he has something he can work with.
Well, I think
potentially move mountains.
I don't know what was in Tozer's mind. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
But the first thing that came to mind was the story of Thomas and Jesus.
Sure.
Because the idea well, his request for proof.
Right.
Show me your hands. I want to see that you are who you are. And I think Tozer is essentially trying to say that Thomas rendered faith superfluous in that moment by seeking out and saying, I can't believe this. I can't believe this. I want to. And Jesus went even a step further to say, touch them, put your hands in them and find out for yourself. Now,
but Jesus also said, you believe because you touched.
Right.
And others will have better faith and still believe, even though they weren't able to.
And Matthew Cortman said in the last book, sorry, Matthew, Matt, we read another book before called Saying No to God. And he kind of looked through that story, if you remember, and he challenged us to even think that Jesus wasn't reprimanding Thomas, but was actually encouraging Thomas in that moment, that his response was simply not just acceptable, but God could handle that kind of thing. And I found great comfort in that. I sometimes, this is another example where I feel Tozer is a bit more black and white as well, where he was saying you either have faith or you either have doubt. But I found great comfort in the perspective that God can handle how I relate to him. And that is actually a part of my faith experience with God, where I'm learning through that. Anyway, so those are some of my...
And there's biblical support for that. I mean, Jesus met people where they were and took them from that point forward.
Right. Indeed. Okay, any other comments, or shall we move on to the next chapter?
What chapter are we on?
We're on chapter 5 now. We're going to move on. Okay, here's where I'm stumped, and maybe you guys can help me.
Are we on chapter 6?
No, chapter 5. I didn't get this chapter, the self-existence of God. Well, I got it, but I don't think I walked away thinking, that was really, there was something about this chapter that I couldn't even summarize. I felt like, this is just my opinion, you guys can respond. I felt like he spent less time focusing on the self-existence of God. The name of the chapter was The Self-Existence of God to our listeners. And I felt like he spent more time on the humility or the will against God. Those are my perspectives of how he came across in that. Like, I agree with the notion that God is self-existent and he is not created. I get that, but I cannot see how that plays into the grand scheme of, I don't know what he was trying to say in the chapter is what I'm trying to be honest and say. That's what I want to say.
So it was a difficult chapter. Sorry.
Go on.
I think, again, he kind of gets started and then he wraps it up a little later in the chapter. And I think the self-existence of God is he's trying to set it up in stark contrast with our belief in ourself and how that self gets in the way of our belief in God.
Right. So he talked more about the power struggle that man has to stop God from his authority than I felt he talked about the actual self-existence of God.
And I can't remember, is it this chapter? I'm frantically looking, but is it this chapter that talked about God having a throne.
Yes, it is. And I even
this one.
And I thought that was incredibly powerful because, you know, I don't know all the fancy words for it, as a metaphor, I think, because I think God does have the throne, and for all practical reasons, he should have the throne. But I think at any moment when we say, hey, I want that, he's off the throne and we're on the throne.
So can I
think it's a God that believes in, you know, our freedom of choice. And I think our freedom of choice can be so slight that that's all it takes. And then one step towards yourself is another step toward yourself. And pretty soon there's no room for God at all in your life. And you're sitting on the throne thinking you're God. And that's, I think, what I took out of this chapter. He
set the context with situating that within the story of Lucifer.
Right.
And that definitely resonated.
That's the story for all of us, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
I think definitely.
So. Bottom of page 41, I'll read the quote. The essence of sin is to will one thing. For to set our will against the will of God is to dethrone God and to make ourselves supreme in the little kingdom of man's soul.
So what page was that?
That was the bottom
41.
of 41.
Yeah, okay.
I agree with John. I thought it was a great way to define sin and really define just our human nature. And I think this is what goes on in our mind. But we may not be conscious of it, but I think this is exactly, it is what it is. It's that constant struggle that, like, who's going to be in control, and we are always wanting to be in control and just set God aside. Whereas this is saying, because we're a creative being, you know, and we really cannot exist apart from God. But we just try that all the time. And I totally see myself in this.
Yeah.
And you know what? Yeah. And you know what? And this is exactly what happens. Pastor Sam, once you have kids, you will realize this. Soon as kids, I mean, this is what happens with our kids. We don't even teach them this. This is exactly what they do. And like us as parents and them as kids, it's their constant struggle to take control and basically dethrone you as a parent, as an authority figure.
I'm sure I will learn as a parent that this dynamic is true, but I'll tell you, as a son, I can attest that this is true, because I want to dethrone my mother and dethrone my father, because I want to tell them I'm in control and I can do this. So I resonate with that. Matt, did you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think nothing extremely stood out, nothing too extreme stood out in this. The theme that I picked out as I was reading this chapter is really the idea of just it's about the supremacy of God, kind of, right? But the idea that being man down here as a created creature, we just can't be at the level of God. There's a illustration that I think very geometrically. And so a book that I've always gone back to, there's a book called Flat World that in my mind has always just kind of laid out what I grasp when I try to think about the dimensionality of God and where he is relative to us, and the idea that he is bigger than we can ever comprehend. And the moment we bring him down to our level, it's an incomplete picture, and we just never will grasp it.
The irony of that, it's not that I'm purposely trying to contradict you or anything, but the irony of that is, and I did highlight this somewhere, is that Jesus is the manifestation of God in mankind, a descending of God into mankind. Actually, I'm sorry to jump back, but it's back on page 33. Page 33, when we talked about the Trinity, middle of it, when he took upon him the nature of man, he did not, this is Tozer saying, he did not degrade himself or become even for a less time than he had been before. God can never become less than himself. For God to become anything that he has not been is unthinkable. I disagree. I think that God is powerful enough to reduce himself in order to try and represent himself in any which way, even though that's incomprehensible to me. he did degrade himself into the skin. There was and maybe is this the next chapter?
Yeah. So I have a little comment on that because that the end, that page 33, 1, 2, 3, end of the third paragraph, he said, for God to become anything that he has not been is unthinkable.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of the cross, Jesus as God took on sin, which is incompatible with God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's as far as I got, because my mind felt like it would explode if I tried to think that out anymore.
You know, I was thinking that reading that sentence on page 33, I was thinking that Tozer was saying that, you know, when God came, you know, Jesus came as a God himself and then incarnated into man. But I thought he was saying as a God, he did not lessen himself in any way, but he just hid his divinity, you know, but of course, as a man, and he didn't use his power of divinity at all. And in that sense, he was fully still God himself, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And but at the same time, even as a man, he demonstrated perfect obedience to God. And in that way, he was really the only perfect man. That's how I read it.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Matt? Because
I was going to say it kind of comes to mind like the transfiguration, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
The disciples had no idea of this aspect of who he was, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until they actually, and it probably was just minuscule part of it, but until they actually saw it and it was revealed that the inherent glory of Jesus, right, and the holiness of Jesus, he kind of kept that hidden, right? That wasn't, I don't think that was something that just he was given at that time. It was revealed to them. And so he's probably right when he's saying that, yeah, you can't, you know, God can't degrade himself, but I think God is he has to be very good about reaching each person where they're at to communicate, because we couldn't communicate with him otherwise.
Right.
He has to inherently hide himself, just like he, you know, told Moses to turn away and look away. Like he has to do that to communicate with humanity, because I don't think our minds could comprehend it in our current state in some ways.
Well, we've been looking at the idea of his supremacy and his incomprehensibility. I'm going to jump forward to page 48. This is on the next chapter, the self-sufficiency of God. Not that if you want to say something on chapter 5, please do. But this kind of speaks to the point of what we're talking about in terms of the genius of God. And I actually thought that Tozer was so poetic when he put it this way. On page 48, kind of like the first third, maybe the second paragraph in, the truth is that the man who walked among us was a demonstration, not of unveiled deity, but of perfect humanity. And then this is the artistic line that I thought was just amazing. The awful majesty of the Godhead was mercifully sheathed in the soft envelope of human nature to protect mankind. Man, I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, and that goes back to what Matt was saying about Moses coming down and having to veil himself.
Yeah, definitely. And there's definitely that takes almost a non-scientific faith, if I'm going to try and use Tozer's words and pictures and phrases and stuff. It takes a non-scientific faith to be able to experience that kind of God, the ability of something so humongous that you cannot even describe, who sheathes himself in the soft envelope of human nature for the protection of mankind, which I thought was absolutely mind-blowing. I thought that was amazing. Any other comments on chapter 5? There's a few comments I have on chapter 6 I want to make, but I want to open it out to you guys.
Let's move on to chapter 6.
Okay. Chapter 6, the self-sufficiency of God. I did think the opening line was, the opening paragraph was quite amazing. Teach us, O God, that nothing is necessary to thee. Were anything necessary to thee, that thing would be the measure of thine imperfection. And how could we worship one who's imperfect? If nothing is necessary to thee, then no one is necessary. And if no one, then not we. I loved it only because it helped me to just situate myself within the framework of the purpose of my existence. The reality is, I don't need to exist. I don't need to function. I don't need to even be here. And guess what? God doesn't even need me to exist as well. And it just accentuates the point. This thing about life to humanity and experience and passion and love and all these various wonderful things that make us human has nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with choice.
Yeah.
And that's
God's choice.
That's amazing. Yeah, God's choice.
God's choice, yeah.
That's amazing. He chooses for us to experience elements of what it's like to be him, hence why we're made in the image of him. And I did think that was quite remarkable. I did think he had a negative undertone throughout this chapter, but what I got from this was in essence that he was trying to really solidify the idea that he has created out of love. I thought that was amazing. Any other comments on chapter 6?
I mean, the only negative. Go ahead, Dee. Sorry.
No, John, go ahead.
I was going to say the only negative undertone to this chapter was, why do we even exist? I mean, if God doesn't need anything, why humanity?
Right.
And jumping off what John just said, that's my thought in that I thought that, okay, so I've always had trouble trying to understand why God created us, right? Knowing that we're gonna sin and all of that, but at the same time, my understanding also is that Satan had already rebelled against God before the creation of the earth. Yes, am I correct?
Yeah,
correct.
I understand. Yeah. So you know how it talked about how I thought God needed us, the humanity, to vindicate his character, because without us, right? Like how is he supposed to do that? And I suppose if we didn't exist, I'm sure there's got to be some other way that which we're not aware of. But in that way, I thought that we weren't necessary, that we weren't needed in God. But I don't know. Like in this reading this. I'm not even sure, because it says that we're really not necessary. We're really not needed by God.
So
I believe, but yeah.
So I wonder how we therefore read the text in Matthew 26, verse 40. I'll read it to you. Then Jesus returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. And his question to them is, couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. My question, therefore, he needed his disciples, right?
But Pastor said, but that is from him as Jesus as a man, not as a God. You know what I mean? So yes, he needed the disciples to stay up with him and pray with him and support him, but not as, because again, like he didn't tap into his divinity at all. He was just acting as a pure human.
So
that's how I see it.
I think you're right. I don't think it had to be this earth and its inhabitants. I think it would have been someone somewhere, for lack of a better word, that would have to play this out for the universe. And unfortunately, Adam and Eve made it so that it's us here and now that are playing it out for the rest of the universe. And I do truly believe that the rest of the universe is on the edge of its seat, watching how this plays out. And I truly believe that it is sending a message to everyone. I also believe, and I don't have any evidence for this, I mean, the original sin with Satan in heaven, once this world is a new world and all sin and death has been taken care of, there is theoretically no reason why there couldn't be another original sin. but I think our existence throughout eternity will always be a constant reminder to everyone. Yep. And in some ways, I do think, I don't think God needs us. I totally believe what Tozer's saying, but I do agree with Sam. He does deal in black and whites and not much in between. I think that a little bit of the in-between stuff is that God does need us to keep that from happening again. Otherwise, Satan is proved right, and that God, created us to serve him without our choice.
Right. Yeah.
Does it?
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you want to chime in, Matt?
I agree totally. I think it's very gray. I think we possibly potentially do damage to ourselves, great damage either direction. I think it almost has to be gray. I think by assuming that we have no worth is really subtly poisonous in the idea that God created us to be an image of him. And if you're saying that has no worth, that's got some deep implications that can work itself really negatively. Yeah. That being said, kind of, I think my favorite sentence from this whole thing that was kind of got me thinking the most was the other side of things, where he's page 46, kind of right in the middle. He said probably the hardest thought I highlighted our natural egotism is to entertain that God does not need our help. And that's like one of the most kind of potentially damning sentences that he has in here for religion more than secularity in some ways, right? And so like that's the other end of this, and I think either side can have its results in real sickness in some ways, I think. So.
Well, I'm going to continue your quote, Matt, because I highlighted the rest of it. I thought it was definitely relevant. We commonly represent him as a busy, eager, somewhat frustrated father, hurrying about, seeking to help to carry out his benevolent plan to bring peace and salvation to the world. And he goes on. That's the picture that I grew up on. That's the picture of God that I definitely was taught, not in any malice or any way by the people who taught it to me, because they were taught it, and before them they were taught it. But I think that it would do us good due diligence to really just balance our opinion on the Almighty and recognize that he is wider, larger, smaller, and more overreaching, and his grace is so much more powerful to really just accept us for who we are and stretch our minds to the reality that God may not be the God that we think he is. And it's for our benefit and favor rather than to our demise. I'm used to the image of this authoritarian God who is waiting to pronounce his judgment over the sins, the sickness of sin that has taken over humanity. I can't remember where, somewhere in these chapters, he said something like the sins of humanity are from sin itself. And I think he was talking about the reality of this is just inherited, and we're just doing our best to work our best through that. Definitely. There was another quote on page 48 that I quickly want to share. Oh no, I already said it. Yeah, that was the amazing quote about how the Godhead was mercifully sheathed in the soft envelope of human nature to protect mankind. Once again, it's just the reality of Tozer articulating the lengths that which God went just to be intimate with humanity. I thought was pretty amazing. Any final thoughts, guys?
I have one. The other quote at the bottom of that page, the last sentence of the last full paragraph, says, "The blessed news is that the God who needs no one has in sovereign condescension set himself to work by and in and through his obedient children."
Amen.
So, I mean, I think that answers the questions, like Matt was saying. I mean, we got to be careful with the extremes. Ironically enough, with Tozer working in black and white, we still got to be careful with the extremes and realize that God's willing to work with us where we are. And it's from his end. I mean, in some ways, the ultimate grace, his sovereign condescension, day in and day out, is to work with us where we are.
Definitely.
Especially in a world of sin.
Definitely agree with that. Any other thoughts before we wrap up? Okay, no other thoughts. That brings us to the conclusion of those 3 chapters. I definitely think that there's a lot to resonate with Tozer, a lot to disagree and be on the fence about, but he definitely challenges us to go deeper with our perception of God, and albeit the knowledge of God. You listeners are invited to come on with us to the journey for Pages to Progress. In the link in the description box, you'll be able to get a link to the Knowledge of the Holy book that you can buy on Kindle or Amazon or whatever it is. Come join us on the journey, read with us. Would love you to be able to enjoy the same journey that we are. Next week, we will be looking at the next 3 chapters. Chapter 7, the eternity of God. Chapter 8, God's infinitude. And chapter 9, the immutability of God. All words that we all know the meaning from when we were 2 years old. But we will hopefully go deeper as we discuss this book, and we shall see you next time when we go deeper into our Pages to Progress journey. But for now, this is good evening from John, Dee, Matt, and myself. God bless you. Take care.